Wonderful. Well, it looks like our attendee numbers have started to level off. So I want to begin today by welcome everyone to the UBC Public Humanities Hub Public Scholarship Speaker Series on Art and Testimony, co-hosted with the University of Victoria's Survivor-Centered Visual Narratives. I'm Andrea Webb, the co-director of the project and a faculty member in the Faculty of Education at UBC. With my colleagues, we welcome you to today's discussion. We want to begin by acknowledging that UBC is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, land on which we are uninvited guests. We are grateful to be able to do this work here, and because today's panel is virtual, we invite attendees to acknowledge in the territory or the territories from which they are joining us today. We also acknowledge that every year, around the 27th of January, UNESCO pays tribute to the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. The date marks the anniversary of the liberation, the Nazi concentration and extermination camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau by Soviet troops. We reiterate and reaffirm our commitment to oppose racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of intolerance and hatred that may lead to group-targeted violence. In today's webinar, hosted by Schallié, Hank Greenspan joins us to talk about human rights, approaches to witnessing, and his experience working with testimony for many years. And now I'll turn it over to Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Andy. Welcome, everyone. As Andy mentioned, I'm a professor of Germanic Studies at the University of Victoria. And prior to introducing Dr. Hank Greenspan, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. In today's webinar session, which launches our 2024 Art and Testimony webinar series, Dr. Hank Greenspan, an internationally renowned Holocaust scholar and multiple award-winning playwright, now emeritus at the University of Michigan, will discuss why his research and teaching became intertwined with his work as a theater artist. What underlies both is the discipline of sustained attentiveness in the service of empathy, imagination, and deepening conversation. More succinctly, Hank says, I'm quoting him, it's all about the schmooze. So I'm deeply humbled and honored that Hank agreed to do this session with us today. I consider Hank my mentor and inspiration, whose sustained collaborative arts-based research with Holocaust survivors has had a tremendous impact on my own community-engaged scholarship and learning. Hank Greenspan's writings, reflections, and insights have also been foundational for the research design of our survivor-centered international SSHRC-funded project that brings together artists, genocide survivors, scholars, archivists, and community partners from 16 countries across the globe. The title of Hank's talk/performance is Listening, Telling, Showing, and Back, the Practice of a Holocaust Scholar, Teacher, Playwright, Actor. Hank's talk and performance will be followed by a Q&A. The chat will be closed during this webinar session, but all of you are invited to submit questions via the Q&A function throughout the session. Thank you, Hank, for being with us today. Over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. I've been saying Charlotte, I left out the E at the end. It's really good to be here, I have to say. I thank everybody involved at UBC. Too many to name, but it really is, I mean, besides the obvious, it's an opportunity that I have never had, which is to sort of review a whole 50 years of work in about 50 minutes. And it will include some performance and some spiel, as you're hearing now, some talk. Never done that before either, sort of put those pieces together. So it will be an adventure, and I hope at least an interesting one, if whatever else. I want to begin by focusing on the word practice, which is, some of you who are my age will know it's the way to get to Carnegie Hall. Practice, practice, practice. But my wife told me, unless you are at least 60, you won't get that joke. But here's the deal. Practice means a couple of different things. It obviously means my own practice as it evolved over the years of engaging survivors. I say it that way because it goes beyond interviewing. That was part of it, especially at the beginning. But it went beyond what I think we're used to, which is a 2 or 3 hour interview, as I'll say. Um, and that's for many the end of the relationship. Not true in my work, as you will hear. So it's my practice as developed, but it is also the practice of survivors themselves. When I say that, I mean the way that they established how to retell, not just what to retell, but how to do it. And as you'll hear, I mean that in every sense of the use of voice, the use of models, the establishment of who they are as a narrative voice, meaning who am I as a survivor to be speaking? The way I summarize it in my work is that survivors are always involved in a kind of double negotiation. On the one hand, trying to determine what they anticipate or have learned will be tellable by them, and what they anticipate and have learned will be hearable by their listeners. Now, as you can imagine, while it's easy to say, this is an enormously complicated process. What is tellable, for example, although we assume it must be the hard stuff, the unbearable stuff, the traumatic stuff, that's part of it. But there are also some things that are simply difficult to impossible to convey, like sensory experience, right? What it feels like to be thirsty to the point of death, to be starving, to be not just cold, but frigid. Primo Levi famously wrote a passage in which he said, we say winter, scare quote, we say cold, but these are different things. Sensory experience in general is almost incommunicable. By definition, it's pre-verbal in that sense. And yet we know that the Holocaust, along with everything else it was an assault, a physical assault, not only killing people, but putting them through the worst possible sensory experiences, torture of all kinds, right? So that is traumatic, but it's also something else. Even without using a trivial example, how do you convey to somebody the taste of something, right, that they've never eaten? You say it tastes like turtle, I guess, but you know, it's not doable. So that's one side. The other side, listeners, what will be hearable? Turns out that listeners have played an enormously important role in my work because obviously they're always on the other side of these conversations. And what survivors say, how they say it, always depends a great deal on their perceptions of who's on the other side and what those people perceive to be what survivors, who they are and what they have to retell, right? Which is complicated. It's evolving. It varies from survivor to survivor. It varies, obviously, in terms of context. Who's on the other side of the table is not always the same person, of course, or people. So what I will say in general is that after 50 years of trying to understand better, not only the what survivors say, but how they say it, I would say I'm at best scratching the surface. Enormously complicated. I'll convey at least a bit, both showing and telling what I mean by that. And then there's the practice of performance of a play. And I want to say here simply that I did not go into this work with a play anywhere in mind, nowhere. I wasn't doing this in order to write a play. It was not preparatory for that. That just kind of happened. And now there are a few different plays, but the one that we'll mainly focus on today is called Remnants. A number of you have seen it in full. Here, I'm just going to do a couple of excerpts to demonstrate other points. But that only happened because in the late 80s, I'd already been at work in these other ways, and I still am at work in these other ways for, 15, 20 years. A student group that I liked, and with whom I hung out as kind of the senior Mouseketeer, said they knew about my work and said, Hank, can you write something for us to perform? They were asked by our local Hillel to do something for a Holocaust conference that was dramatic. And I said no. And I was, I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I had, was not part of who I was or my skill set. But it turns out there were certain things kicking around, things I had heard over the years from survivors that, you know how it is. One thing led to another, and monologues began to emerge, and a group of 7 became this piece, Remnants. As I said, I'll be doing 2 of them today. Those who've seen the whole piece know that there is a reason one follows the other. There is a trajectory. You won't see that today, but again, there are other good reasons, I think, to do it. So I'm going to begin from that end. It's not the end in which things happen in terms of my own work, but I think it will help us see certain things. And, theater makes much of showing versus telling. It's a gray area, I would say. There's a lot of telling in theater and blah, blah, blah. But it may help us get a handle on some of that. And there are other reasons in terms of what follows. So this is a monologue called Burying the Cemetery. And when you do a piece like this, it is become appropriate to say, some people may find this disturbing. And here's what I'd say. If you don't find it disturbing, that would really be disturbing, right? But, I get it. And especially if you're not used to this kind of account. And it is the only part of Remnants in which atrocity is depicted directly. Actually, it's kind of atrocity after the atrocity that's depicted. But you'll see. So here it is. Burying the Cemetery. How do you destroy an entire people? Think about it. It's not an easy thing to do. It is not only killing millions of individuals, though it is certainly that, and it is not only degrading their culture, their way of life, though it is certainly also that. But to destroy a people, you also have to wipe out every trace, the slightest possible trace of their existence. You have to destroy all the evidence, not only that they ever lived, but also that they ever died. Late in the war, in one of the camps I was in, our job was to dig up the corpses of those whom the Germans had killed earlier. This happened in many of the places where they didn't have crematoria. There were mass graves, huge burial trenches all over Poland and Russia and the Baltics. The people had been shot or gassed or just buried alive. Little children were often buried alive. They didn't want to waste bullets. So our job was to dig up the corpses. Excuse me for a minute. And the German and Ukrainian guards screamed and beat us while we piled the bodies onto huge pyres. And then they poured gasoline on the bodies and set them on fire. In this camp, even burning the bodies was not the end. They also took the gravestones from the Jewish cemeteries in that area. And many of the stones they had us break up, turn them into gravel, to use to pave the muddy roads. And some were brought in to be stone platforms, like workbenches, when we were burning the bodies. After the bodies were burned, we had to collect all the ashes and put them on the workbenches, on the gravestones. And if there were any large pieces of bone, or even little pieces, SS made us grind them up. We had other pieces of stone from the gravestones. So we were able to grind all the pieces of bone into a fine gray powder. Chief SS officer had a sieve that he carried. And all the prisoners had to bring him the ashes they had ground up. All the remains of the people had to be able to pass through the sieve. At the end, the gravestones that we were using as workbenches were also ground up. And the gravel and the ashes were mixed together with sand and spread around in the soil. And more soil was added over that. and grass seed was laid down. After a few weeks, grass started coming up. It looked just like any other meadow. There was no sign that anything unusual had ever happened there. And that's how the Germans murdered the murder of my people, and how we buried the cemetery. The opening line of this monologue, how do you destroy an entire people, is of course the same. It's equivalent to saying, so what is genocide? What is genocide? And normally in a talk, one would talk about different genocides, maybe some comparison, maybe the role of the Genocide Convention legally. Inevitably, these days there would be discussion of whether certain events constitute genocide, what and don't, and what that means. That would be telling. This monologue begins with something like that, the exposition of how do you do it? Is it this? Is it that? But then it becomes a personal account. And if you ask, what is the purpose of, what is this guy trying to do? I would say he's trying to unbury the cemetery in the sense of saying, you know, I would say it's not just grass. It's not that nothing happened here. That's his goal. And I say that because in drama, that's what most scenes are about. Someone is trying to do something and is trying to create a relationship with listeners that accomplishes something. And what this guy is trying to do is to show us this is true, this is real, this happened. Yeah? It's a different emphasis. It's not better, worse. It's another way of talking about what this phenomenon is. Now, I will say when I heard it, it's one action after the other. This is the practice of the perpetrators. Kill people, unbury them, pile them up, burn them, scatter the ashes, etc., etc. My goal was to say something essential about what genocide is in a short amount of time. This is a relatively short monologue. It may or not be surprising that in those days, I didn't think people would have a lot of time to think about this history and think about some of these concepts. And so I thought of Remnants as a whole as a kind of time capsule in which each individual bit might be useful, particularly because it was condensed and it was, in that sense, a short piece. I think that if I can say it this way, that's part of why it has worked. Part of why it has worked. Okay, so I'm going to go back now to the beginning, to my practice at the start. I've often said, and some of you have heard me say, that I was very lucky that I began when I did in the 1970s. And among other reasons, it was because a number of survivors were very ready by then. Many were ready much earlier, actually, to talk with someone like me. And certainly there were important projects gathering survivors' accounts from the beginning, even before the war ended. And some of you will know about the Ringgold archives in Warsaw Ghetto, the historical commissions that develop often run and organized by survivors themselves, which collected thousands of accounts. Yad Vashem over the years. So there was certainly work that had been done way before the 1970s, connection with Eichmann trial and so on. But the model that has become almost presumed, which is 2 or 3 hours in front of a video camera with a stranger, meaning a stranger to that survivor, asking questions, getting a more or less chronologic account, that's become the sort of standard. That's what people expect when they hear interview with a survivor. That model, at least in the way that it has become presumed and institutionalized, mostly didn't exist when I began, which meant that survivors and I were free to make it up as we went along, to wing it, right? And one of the things that we winged was to meet as often as it seemed useful, which meant interesting, informing, engaging, whatever that meant, as long as we chose. And I didn't assume that that would be the same for each person. Why would it be? So with some people, it was a question of meeting multiple times over months, even weeks, say 4, 5, 7, 8, 12 times. For some people, it was years, in which we'd often begin kind of intensively every week or every 2 weeks, and then it would be more spread out. And with a few people over decades, likewise. I think Augie Rubin is a survivor whom you'll hear many times today from me and through me, very close person in my life. Augie and I met every week for a year, every Monday, a couple of hours discussing and reflecting on the war and the years that followed. And then lunch, which was one of the best parts. And you all know over lunch, things get said that are different, right, than on a tape. And of course, the longer that we got to work together and knew each other, the more candid and so on. A lot of these reflections were. Sometimes they could be worked back into our more formal discussion, sometimes not. And that's how it is. It's true for all of us, yes? We're not always speaking in the mode of for the record, for posterity, which is what testimony is. And by the way, I would say that Burying the Cemetery monologue really is as close to testimony in the formal sense, really is, than the rest of the segments of Remnants. So that really is testimony. I was there. I witnessed this. You should know this. Okay. So this notion of meeting multiple times came from survivors, first of all. I was a grad student. I didn't know exactly, what time I would have, but they would say, come back next week. We'll talk some more. I said, sure. So we did. I think it's a natural inclination of someone also trained. None of this was a therapy of any kind. But it's natural for psychologists to kind of assume that discussions like this are going to probably require more than a single session. So that's what happened. Came back, came back, came back. Now, another thing that followed as part of my practice was that I would listen to my interviews between, knowing that I would be back in most cases. That would clue me as to what I wanted to pursue further. Okay. Now, anyone who's listened to their interviewing knows it's a very humbling process. You hear all the stuff that you wish you'd asked, all the stuff you missed, all the stuff, you asked the wrong thing. But, that could be corrected by, at least to some extent, by a next visit. There's one other thing that became very relevant to this dramatic work that followed. I did my own transcribing, at least initially, and really trying to get all the ers and ahs initially, and then later some paraphrase. But either way, people who do transcribing know it takes forever, right? 10 minutes of an account may take an hour if you want to get all the ers and ahs. What that meant in practice is I would be listening and listening over and listening over to the same small segment multiple times in order to catch all the bits, all the ways that people said things. And it has been said in oral history, if you really did it, there ought to be musical notation, because there's so much in voice, any voice, that goes beyond or around, we'll say, the words. Yeah? The ways that people use cadence, the ways that people use silence, which is tremendously various. The little expressions that some people use, I'm just saying, the ways they structure sentences, the way they present themselves, all the ways that the how of retelling, not just the what, but the how. I think those things are entirely intertwined. I don't think you can easily engage and comprehend a survivor's account if you don't have some sense of the how as well as the what. They're all intertwined. But you can imagine that hearing these voices again and again and again and again, and their differences, turned out to be useful preparation for when it came to that time when I wanted to show them, not just write about them or speak about them. Besides the physicality of voice itself, which means breath, which means tongues, which means everything that goes into speech, as well as establishing who one is, as I said earlier, as a survivor. There's setting the stage in general, of which survivors are very conscious. So we tend to think we tend not to think about it, partly because our usual way of engaging is fairly structured. They'll be in the studio, they'll be at their home. And, with the video camera, there's a sort of frame that most people stay in. With my practice, audio just sort of sat there on the table, a little tape recorder, which made it easy to bring. And also, it made it easy for the survivors to literally set the stage and move around. Not everybody did, of course, but they were not blocked in by the sense of a frame, of a movie frame. So, for example, a man named Victor, who endured about a week in Treblinka. Very few people did that and survived, but he did. And he spent the rest of the war hiding in the woods mostly. And he got up. He was that kind of guy. He was a show kind of guy, not a performer, but he really wanted me to understand. Again, there was that insistence of, I really want you to know this. So he would get up and he would walk around the room and he would sort of get behind the chairs as though they were trees. And he said, so this is where I sit there, put myself, and I could see the Germans over there, and I'm behind the trees here. So he showed me. Yeah. So survivors in that sense, and I suppose all of us, are performing too. And of course, I don't mean that in any superficial sense. That doesn't mean they're acting somebody else. It means they're using performative technique as part of their craft of speaking, as part of their practice of speaking. Okay. Two examples that are in some ways, well, they're different. You'll hear. One woman named Natalie, who I write about, was very often called upon to speak publicly in her area. And she was very good at it. And she told me that when she speaks publicly, she draws on the techniques of Stanislavski in order to be effective. Now, I don't know Stanislavski very well, but if you know the name, you'll know that he was the dean of Russian drama, of theory of acting, theory of directing, etc. The point here is that it gives you an idea, perhaps an extreme example, of just how self-conscious survivors can be about the how of retelling, not only the what. Of course, memory doesn't just flow up from wherever it sits and come out of mouth. So all kinds of mediations, as we say, along the way. Another example, which in some ways it's not exactly a converse, but it's a different kind of about nonverbal dimension. A survivor named Lydia, whose story is actually the opening of Remnants. The first line of the play is, during the war, I lost my voice. That was literally, she was muted during the war by terror. And she was not able to speak for a few years. And what the monologue does is retells how she regained voice over the years, at that time and later. But my sense was always that she regained voice, but not fully, meaning there was always something recreated. It wasn't complete in the voice that she regained. And I felt that partly because, first of all, she was a minimalist in what she said. Her sentences tended to be punctuated, as I am mimicking a little, and very short. So this is a, quote, tough interview, right? When someone is not saying that much and what they're saying is punctuated. Very often, I found myself, in a certain sense, muted because, like, what do I ask next? I don't want to call it pulling teeth because, you know what I'm saying, but it put me in a way on the spot. But that was all informing, yeah, about what's going on. And if you're a psychologist, as I am, you think about these things. And what is this? What is this about? What is this telling me? Here's the other thing I really want to emphasize about nonverbal and what is there and what we hear and what we see from survivors. Lydia, while speaking in this way, with a little emotion outwardly, in this punctuated, minimalist way, tears were coming down her cheeks at various points along the way. I don't know if she was aware of them or not, My sense is a little, but they just sort of came. She's speaking in that way. The tears are coming in their way. When I wrote about this once, I described the tears as having a mind and memory of their own. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's as though she was speaking without speaking in this way as much as this way. So again, the retelling is a complicated, multifaceted project, practice again. Some deliberate, like Stanislavski, some not so deliberate, I assume. One other aspect or two other aspects of this practice. I decided as I was listening over to these segments, some of them, especially the ones I felt, oh my goodness, I kind of missed the point here. I would bring to a next interview segments from a prior one. It was easy to do with audio tape, right? So I would take bits, 2, 3 minutes. I mean, I'd bring the whole tape, but I would select whatever short amount of time. And the survivors and I would pour over them together. And I have to say, you know, survivors, again, and I'll say this 1,000 times, survivors are like us, right? In every way except we weren't there. But in terms of these issues, there's essentially no key difference, except we weren't there. So survivors say, oh, I don't sound good on tape, like we all do. But I have to say that they really engaged in this process. I mean, it was this makes sense, a kind of Talmudic process of not just reading a text and interpreting, but going back, and new things would arise, new memories. And they would explain, oh, well, I didn't really tell you this. So there's more to know here. And so one thing led to another, led to another, led to another, which was not only explicated the original interview, but added more. And they became very engaged, and we did, obviously, together. Again, Augie describing that process. And those of you who know me know that I will quote this line at any opportunity. She was talking about not just our interviews, but her most memorable ones. One thought sparks another, and then another, that I may not have even known I had. This is the part that is so gratifying. Whatever I imagine I'm teaching, I'm learning at the same moment. We're learning together. Learning together. If there are 2 words that summarize what my real goal has been in my career, my so-called career, that's it. Learning together, whether it's in an interview, whether it's in a classroom, in a seminar in particular, whether it's with an audience, people who've seen remnants or whatever piece. It's the schmooze. That's what I mean by it. It's that process of learning together where you get places that you didn't know you knew, as Augie said, because you didn't know them. I mean, you wouldn't have known them if it weren't for the opportunity. We all know that I think many of us are teachers here. When a seminar is really cooking, that's what happens. People bounce off each other and build on what others have said if they are paying attention. And new stuff happens that was in nobody's head going in. Knowledge is created in that process of learning together. And that is, as Ali said, even about this horrific stuff, gratifying. I would even say can be exhilarating, incredibly exhilarating. There's a kind of ecstasy in that process of learning together when it's cooking in any of these situations. So I suppose, sometimes people ask, what kept you going? Well, I guess what kept me going above all were those kind of moments. And indeed, what I was learning with the survivors, not only from them, but with them. Now, as you would assume too, when you have that kind of working relationship, that kind of collaboration, it becomes welcome and possible for people to be more open, candid, straight on than they might otherwise be, because you're friends. That's how we are with friends, right? You can say things off the record. Don't tell them but this is what I think. And so I had that great privilege too, in which survivors would share things, reflections, and so on, especially about being a survivor and being known as such and being engaged in all the rhetoric, which some of you know is endless and repetitive, and absolutely predictable. When it's time for the survivor to speak, boom, 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 boom. Survivors have comment on that, you know? They have feelings, as you will hear. Two very quick examples is one from Augie again. Well, actually, this is from Leon, who was a brilliant man. He's, in some ways, Augie is both the head and the heart of my work. Leon is too. And has nothing to do with being a survivor. He's just a brilliant dude. And he was not afraid to say the truth that he perceived as such. So, among other things, he would tell me that the rabbi would often invite him to speak every year, actually, for Holocaust Remembrance Day, for Yom HaShoah. And he told, direct quote, invariably, I refuse. I don't think that this sort of inspirational address, which is what the rabbi wanted, is sharing with anybody the reality of the Holocaust. I'm not against inspirational addresses, but from Leon's perspective, inspirational addresses do not in any obvious way follow from the reality of the Holocaust. And by the way, burying the cemetery was his experience. So if you can imagine being invited to do an inspirational address, and what's among other memories in your head is that scene, is that going to be an inspirational? Obviously not. Obviously not. So rather than be provocative as I might be, he bowed out. Not this year, etc. Augie, as always, once exclaimed in a moment of pique, and Augie was not that peakable, but in this case, she was frustrated, and she said, "I'm not a quote unquote capital S Holocaust survivor. Okay, I survived, but I'm not the survivor. I'm not a category. I'm not a thing. We have enough experience being categories." So that's, yeah, you all get what that means. It doesn't mean she was always greeted that way, of course. My students, and she had a zillion friends, and she was not alone in the role of the survivor, but in formal, sort of official occasions, that was sometimes what happened, and predictable. And we all know that you can stigmatize people by putting them on the podium or putting them in the consulting room, right? In the asylum. Either way, that's distancing. Either way, it's not engaging them as folks. Even, not us in the sense of, obviously we didn't share those experiences, but us in every other way. Us in every other way. And if we don't see it that way, when survivors become epiphenomena of the history, effectively museum pieces, which I've seen expressed, then what's the point? Then it didn't happen to anybody except those Holocaust people. And behind the survivors, the vastly greater number who did not survive, they also become other. And so, in a way, it has nothing to do with us. But of course, it has, in essence, everything to do with us as human beings. Okay. One other bit of practice, looking at time. This is how I usually introduce remnants. I note that, with any good friends, every now and then our friend will say something extraordinary. And it could be a story, it often is, that they've told many times before, a particular episode, but it's though at these times they find an image, or maybe just a cadence of voice, perhaps a new memory that hasn't been shared before, but something that just nails it. I mean, these are moments that blow you away. It's these moments of natural poetry that are, I always think of they're gifts. They are indeed gifts. In my work, when I used to do therapy, and again, this was not therapy at all, but when people hit on that kind of image, that kind of way of saying how it is for them, that nailed it, they would often tear, not I think in the case as with Lydia, because it was necessarily sad, but because it was true. And when people discover the capacity to articulate something profoundly true that they have never quite done that way before, it's a release. And I think that tearing had something to do with that release. So these are those kinds of moments. Remnants as a whole is a trajectory of those kinds of moments. I'm about to hear one now from Augie, of course. One of the things that I will say is important in my sense of that work and in general is that these are not images that are iconic Holocaust images. Yes, in Remnants, there is a train. Yes, there's a camp, and so on. But there are also flying saucers and space aliens and how to survive the loss of a love books and here a vanity in a bathroom and makeup. All kinds of images that are not Holocaust connected for most of us. And I will tell you that people say crazy nice things in general about the piece, at least the people who share it tell me. But my favorite comment is when people tell me it's not what I expected, or that it was unexpected. Because again, it kind of goes with Augie saying, I'm not the survivor. In my bilious view, if you can have a bilious view, it's a little gross. You know, we are dealing, when we deal with this topic, with a mountain of presumption. And it gets taller every day, and rhetoric, and especially in popular Holocaust memory. I'm not talking, not to privilege my academic colleagues, but there's some wonderful historical work being done now, really brilliant, important work. But in the realm of, say, popular discourse about this, there's a lot that is the expected. And even if, again, people are moved and interested in all of that, but also it's rare, I think, that they feel, geez, I never heard that before, that they didn't sort of feel on some level going in. Oh, been there, know that, some version of that. So if this piece can get around or under or whatever it is, that fence, then I think I've succeeded. Why? Why does it matter? Because this is for the same reason that burying the cemetery matters. Let's not cover it over with grass seed, huh? Let's understand what it was. Inspirational messages are fine, but it's not the Holocaust history. It's not the lesson of the Holocaust. I don't know what the lesson is, to be honest. I don't think any of us really do. I'm not a lessons guy. I'm a schmooze guy. As I said, I don't know what the lessons are, but if we can talk about it, that's fine. That's enough. So this is another monologue called The Vanity, which is, as I said, from Augie, essentially, and it is the end, it is the anchor of the whole play. It's the end of the piece. Okay. So I don't get in the way at the end. I also say this, which was interesting. Augie has seen Remnants many times. And I would often go with her, as I said, to schools and so on. And whether I was there or not, I would hear afterward. And over the years, I noticed that she would tell this particular episode, if she did, in a way that was closer to the play, to my sort of reconstruction, than initially she told it. To be honest, I was first quite uncomfortable with that. I said, wait a minute, I wasn't there. So I'm impacting the way a survivor would tell. It didn't seem kosher. But then I at least realized this. We do that all the time. Yeah, we tell stories, whatever story, to a friend, and they will come back with, is it a little bit like this? They'll make a connection that we hadn't seen, or come up with an image that we may not have had ourselves that seems to nail it for us, our friend's image, our friend's way of connecting something. And so the next time we tell that particular episode to a different person, we may well borrow from our friend's image, etc. We won't give them a footnote, of course, because this happens all the time in life. Yeah. So once again, it's learning together. Once again, what happens between people becomes the essential thing. So yes, I borrowed Agi's experience to create this monologue. She borrowed some of it back in her later retelling. There's nothing weird about that, if I may say, but it's something that we probably don't think much about. Maybe we should. We all want to have my story, right? My story, your story, etc. Narrative, 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 right? Everything is narrative. My narrative, your narrative. Let's have our narrative as much as possible. Okay. The vanity. Whenever I'm introduced as a survivor, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. I mean, what do people want? What do they expect? In the beginning, until just the last few years, nobody wanted to hear from us. Everybody said, this is to forget. Life goes on. Hush up your bad dreams. Like, this may sound silly, but we heard in this country, when you laugh, the whole world laughs with you. And when you cry alone. So that's exactly what we did. We said, we're Americans too. And we are. And we kept our memories to ourselves. Now, today, everybody makes a big deal out of it. I mean, they don't just invite us to speak, but they turn us into some kind of heroes. They talk about the special wisdom we're supposed to have and the precious legacy we're supposed to pass on and all the tales and legends we're supposed to be able to retell. What is this? A bar mitzvah? A celebration of our Jewish roots? I mean, we, whose roots were totally destroyed, are supposed to have a precious legacy? And we, who can hardly speak at all, are supposed to tell you fabulous tales and legends? In the beginning, people were silent. Today, they are stupid. But I'll tell you, I'm stupid too. I'm stupid too. I don't have wisdom. I don't even know what I think. I mean, I lived through it. I remember it. But even I don't know what the Holocaust means, or what we should believe about it. One memory I'll tell you, because then maybe you will understand this stupidity of mine. You know, I was part of the time in Birkenau. Birkenau. That was the part of Auschwitz where they had the gas chambers and the shower room and the crematoria. Birkenau was where they killed most of the people in Auschwitz. And I was in a group of prisoners who sorted the clothes of those who had already been gassed and burnt. After they went into the shower room, gas chamber, we came out and packed up the clothes they left behind. And also in Birkenau, there was the prisoner's latrine. You know, where we went to the toilet, which was really just a bench, a row of holes over a pit filled with quicklime. So this was where we went to the bathroom. And in the latrine of Birkenau, the SS took one lady, one of the prisoners, and they made her the Scheißkapo. This was a joke for the SS. It means the shit commander. That was her title. It was on a sign she wore around her neck. And her job was to watch the toilet and be like a kind of attendant. She had to keep it neat and clean. One day I noticed Scheißkapo had managed to find a few boxes. Somehow she got a couple of old crates made of wood, and she put them together with the little one in front so she could sit on it. And she also had a little mirror that she probably found in her clothes from one of the prisoners who had been killed. So with the boxes and the mirror, she made like a little bureau. She put the mirror over the big box and she sat on the little box and made like a little vanity in the corner of the latrine. A little vanity in the corner of the ladies' room. Whenever I think about the Holocaust, I ask myself, what does it mean? I think about this memory. It's not easy to do. Try to keep the picture, all the elements of the picture, together in your mind at one time. A vanity in the latrine in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now you tell me. You tell me, because I don't know myself. Does it inspire your hope or your revulsion that the attendant in the toilets of hell made a place to put on her makeup? That's the vanity. Based on the discussion that we've had to this point, you hear some of what I was suggesting. The whole beginning is, of course, a critique, some of it pretty harsh. In the beginning, people were silent. Today, they're stupid. That's probably the harshest line in the play. But in a very Aggie-esque way, it's not exactly qualified, but it changed because she says, you know, I'm stupid too. There isn't the expectation that we should nail it, that we should really know. This should leave us confused. It should leave us unresolved. I'll come back to that. But there is that list, the legacy, the heroes, and then many other survivors whom I've known and whom it'd be easy to cite, who say the same essential thing. And others who are proud to be celebrities. You know, I don't want to suggest that everyone resists that. There's another very close friend of Augie's too, a guy named Abe. And, you know, Abe accepts it. He says, yeah, so now I was a little kid in Romania. I love doing Abe. He's fun to do, right? And now I'm such a hero. Why not? Why not? We deserve it. And he uses his newfound celebrity status, newfound over the last 30, 40 years, in order to make certain points. He makes use of it for his own purposes. So it's not all, you know, don't make me a hero. Some, you know, welcome the chance. You know, a little pleasure. Why not? Indeed, why not? Why not throw out the first ball? You know, not all critiqued. But for Augie, it is what it is for some others, some number of others, at least the folks I know, like Leon. And so there's all of that in the monologue leading up to that moment when she starts to tell the story of the Scheiß couple being in Birkenau. And this is the one that I really mean as the example of what I was saying, an image that just floored me. And I think, as far as I know, was not anticipated by Augie either, at least not consciously. But it's the move when she says a little bureau, and then she switches a little comma, a little vanity. And that's verbatim, a little vanity in the corner of the train. So the move from bureau to vanity blew me away. Bureau is powerful enough, right? And especially after Scheißkopf and all that. But vanity, in this context, is flooring. Vanity of vanities. Yes, it's Ecclesiastes. Vanity of all is vanity. It obviously is a gendered image as well, with all the fragility that entails a woman, even more than Bureau with a mirror, putting on makeup, in latrine, in Birkenau. How do you put that together? I think, as Agi says in the monologue, the point is you don't put it together. And one of the most important things, and this is true in this monologue, and it's true in most of the other ones in Remnants, not all, that it is not resolved at the end. There is no resolution. Does it inspire your hope or your revulsion? Each of you will probably come up with some, well, it's more this or more that. What I hope, at least, is that you don't know, or the answer is some version of both, or the answer is some version of I don't know, or it's some version of let's talk about it. That's my favorite, because one of the results of irresolution is that people want to talk about it. Maybe to find some higher synthesis, maybe just to bat it around, maybe because it's conducive to learning together on whatever side, and go places and discover things that are not in anybody's head going in. So that above all is for me the reason to leave things and to have things unresolved. One could say, without resolving them, that there is a certain sense of vanity, and I don't mean callousness, that how do you get through life? I mean, why are we doing what we're doing? Why am I sitting here looking at a computer screen and we're schmoozing and you're out there? Shouldn't we be in the street screaming? Whatever we're screaming, given what's going on in the world right now? Why do we think we have time to do this? Well, because we do, and we all get up and we go to our vanity. This is not in any way a critique. And we do what we do. And we pay attention to the world, ideally, and we do what we can do in that realm as well. So it's inevitable, I think, but I don't want to solve it too easily because it's never solvable, right? How much vanity in that sense of doing what we do, and how much throwing it up in the air and saying, oh, damn it, I've got to go do something else now with my life or with this day. And that's, again, where the schmooze comes in, sorting that out in our heads and ideally with other folks who are asking similar, related, complementary questions, which is a good place for me, especially given the time, to stop and open it up for some schmooze. Let's learn together. So I will stop.
Thank you so much, Hank. Your talk performance has been such a beautiful example of, I'm quoting you here, conjoining the professional and the personal, mind and heart, without sliding either. So thank you. Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask our participants to put their questions in the Q&A function. Please feel free to do so throughout the next 15-20 minutes, but you also have half an hour if you like to schmooze longer with Hank. And I'm going to read the first question from Anna P. And Anna writes, have you interviewed survivors from Eastern Europe who miraculously survived, in quotation marks, the mass murder committed by the Einsatzgruppen and local collaborators? Father Patrick Dubois identifies this mass genocide, nearly 2 million, as Holocaust by bullets. And if you did interview these survivors, did you notice any differences in their ability to share the horrors they witnessed and experienced?
The short answer is no. I did not interview survivors who, I've met some along the way, but not in any depth. In a way, Leon's experience, the burying the cemetery, which is different, but it is about a mass grave. So to that extent, it's maybe a connection, but it did not happen in Ukraine, and it did not happen in the group. But of course, that is a history in which is what DeBois' work is all about, sort of unburying, literally and figuratively, those cemeteries. So which were not cemeteries, but mass pits. So anyway, short answer, no.
Then the next question by Aaron Goodman. Thank you very much. Is there value in researchers working with second and third generation survivors? Are there stories, testimonies, and maybe still need to talk about the word testimonies, post memories important to discover together in your view? Or is it more important to work with aging child survivors?
Yeah, but I wouldn't rank it in, in terms of what's more and less important. I mean, I am the age of many children of survivors. So a lot of my friends, folks who I know well, although I'm not a child of survivors myself, I was part of our local child of survivor group in Michigan. I called myself a consigliere, not really part of the family, but, I was a associate. So I know folks very well. And I actually interviewed some early on in my work because I was interested in the transmission process within the families. Is it important? I guess everything is potentially important. I try to say this in a clear and concise way. I'm not much of a believer in the way intergenerational trauma has become a shtick. Very popular notion. There's a question there of why it's become so interesting, not only to people involved, but to the press, the media, and so on. I mean, it's become really, again, part of the language of our time, not only in Holocaust context, but in all kinds of contexts. I mean, it's on the news every 5 seconds now, intergender. I think, obviously, it makes a tremendous difference. Family history matters. Parents, etc. I mean, this is life for everybody. Whether trauma itself, I think that there's so much confusion about what it is that is supposed to be transmitted that I have trouble with it. I also am not entirely comfortable with second generation survivors, which will probably upset some people as an expression, or third. Survivors are survivors. If they're second generation survivors, then it's kind of like all of us, which again is not to say it does not matter. And of course, I understand if the survivors hadn't survived, there wouldn't be a second generation, third generation. I get that. But that's true in a lot of histories. So again, and I wouldn't rank who's important to interview. What I believe in general, and this is very general, is that what children of survivors know, of course, is not the Holocaust directly, but they know their folks. And if there's any question about not turning survivors into the capital S survivor, if you grow up with folks who are folks, your parents, and you really know who they are because you've seen them, in all dimensions probably in life, then that is informing. And that is a good corrective, I think, to a lot of the more general presumptions that we have. Now, I just quickly say that in my early interviews with survivors, it was not unusual for their kids to be kind of around the corner, and they know it, to be not in the room, but next door or just outside the door. And they told me, and said they realized, in talking to you, I'm talking to my son, who I know is listening in. And then they explained and said, but you're not going to be here talking to me at breakfast tomorrow. So if what I say is upsetting or whatever troubles you, I'm not going to see it the next day. So without obviously intending this, I ended up early on serving as a bit of a mediator for some survivors to retell to their kids in that role. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question. I think if people have human experience to share, stories to tell and share with each other, I'm all for it, whoever they are.
Thank you, Hank. I'm reading a comment and then another question. The comment is from project participant Bis Nijam. Thank you for this really rewarding presentation. I've seen how Lynn Hirschler has approached and adapted your work, but unfortunately, Bees cannot stay to ask her own questions. So just wanted to honor her comment. And Misha Menzer has a question. Thank you for your talk. Both interesting and thought-provoking. One of survivors rejected the idea of inspirational talks. However, my question is rather than inspirational, is the real issue not what lesson should we take from the Shoah and testimony of survivors so that listeners can take action or speak out when hearing this testimony, can take action early when hate against the other appears today? I hope, Misha, I apologize for the typo. I hope I read it how you intended to convey it.
You know, of course, the answer is yes. What I think that may be a little bit more than yes is that, and I've written this, the essential reason, in my view, and the necessary and sufficient reason to listen to survivors is to listen to survivors. We don't need other instrumental reasons. Yeah. Just as we wouldn't need them to listen to others who've gone through whatever hell and somehow come out the other side. That's a sufficient reason, in my view. So whether it is conducive to tolerance or political action against fascism or whatever other thing may happen, is whatever may happen. But it's not the reason, in my view, not the core reason, ultimately. And I also think sometimes we put survivors in the role of and a burden that they can't carry and shouldn't. We don't need survivors to tell us that mass murder is mass murder. We don't need survivors to tell us that tolerance is a good thing. If we don't know that, then we don't know that. Does it inspire in that sense? And I think that was the question. It can. I mean, I think of my own students over the years. The ones where that really mattered in general were the folks who already were activists, and hearing from survivors confirmed what they were already doing in their lives. So it added strength. The ones who weren't rarely changed, at least as a result. I think, what makes people, if we're talking about activism in that sense, it's so complicated. And by the time they certainly get to a college course, most people it's not going to be listening to a survivor that for most people will matter. I frankly don't think, but it may add. And in terms of awareness, as we all know, one could take the quote lessons in 100 ways, but one grim way is to say, well, yeah, we've been doing this. I didn't quote Augie. It's in one of our car conversations, but she asked me the same question that you did, which was, do you think it's doing any good? Our speaking in schools and so on. Does it make any difference? Does it make any difference? And she asked that again, sort of off the record. And I think it, of course, makes a difference. I wouldn't be doing what I've been doing all these years if I didn't. But I think it makes multiple differences, some of which will show in the way that you described, and other ways. Leon, who is, as you heard, a little more edgy about these things, said, I don't think we learned anything, we meaning the world, and from the Holocaust. But at least my kids won't be caught unprepared as we were when something like this happened. And he thought it was fairly likely that something like this to Jews would happen. And if we look around the world at this moment, enough said, right? So, yeah. So, yeah, I wouldn't boil it down to the lesson, but I don't think you're saying that. But I think, yes, sure, that can be part of it for some folks.
And Hank, I want to add to you mentioning the burden of memory for the survivor. It's sometimes the burden of not remembering for survivors as well, that we put them into a situation where we ask them to remember something that they can't. Mm-hmm. It's a blank, it's a void they can no longer access. So,
yep.
And I want to follow up with Nancy Nelson's question. Nancy writes, I would like to hear more about Hank's reluctance about multi-generational trauma.
Oh boy. You know, I think you've probably heard what I would say right now, Nancy. You know, I think it would get into the weeds too much. Um, and I can't tell you that I've looked at all the studies. I think it's come to mean, again, like testimony, one of those words that's come to mean, or phrases that come to mean so many different things. It's an umbrella term. And so really what I would advocate is let's slow down, let's take a harder look, let's look at the different things that we think we're talking about when we're talking about this. Let's let's differentiate these phenomena, and then we'll see what we have. Because for some people, you know, it's measured by levels of hormone response and stress response. For others, it has to do with actual memories that are not their own or nightmares. I mean, there's a lot of different phenomena here that go under that rubric. I'm not a big rubric guy, even though I use them like all of us. So that's what I'd say. I just think it's time to slow down and be a little more careful. So I'm not, you know, I'm not saying no, but I'm not saying a full-throated yes either. I'm saying let's slow it down. Let's take a closer look. Do I have time to ask my question for folks?
Oh, yes, go ahead. Sure.
Okay. If there are other questions lined up, I
Oh,
will.
there's quite a few other questions. Do you want us to?
Let's do that, and then if we have time, you know, I'm gonna call on the folks to help me a little bit. But anyway, should I do that? I'll do that.
Go ahead. Your choice.
So in the now 30 plus years I've been doing the play Remnants, there is always a discussion like this after. And during, it's probably 300 or so performances. 90% of the time I get a question on survivor guilt. It's sort of everyone's favorite psych concept. Now I get 90% of the time a question on trauma, including intergenerational trauma. I could count on two hands, so 10 times or less, the number of times that anyone has spontaneously asked, how do survivors contend? How do they deal with loss on this scale, like burying the cemetery scale loss? How do they do that? How do they live with that if they live with it at all? How do they deal with it? And I argue anyway that loss and trauma are not the same thing. Of course they're related, but everything in psychological life is related. So a specific question of loss, which I would say is, I mean, what's more essential to being a survivor than loss? I'm still here as a survivor, and most of my world, not to mention my folks, are not. Loss is at the core, and yet people don't ask me about it. Why not? That's my question for all of you. And if I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So you can, yeah, if you want to say it out loud, that'd be cool.
Whatever your choice is. If you like to speak rather than type your response into the Q&A, feel free to use the raise hand function and we will unmute you. Nancy Nelson.
Yay, Nancy. Nancy is here as impersonating.
There's a unmute. My first reaction, Hank, and you know me well enough on Zoom to know that I can answer pretty quickly sometimes and not be as thoughtful as you are. But I just think it's such a huge, scary issue of loss. I mean, and I only know it on small pieces compared to what survivors of any kind of Holocaust terror then or now are faced. It's just, I don't know, that huge question of how do we go on in the midst of this? I'm like you know, why are we not all out in the street screaming? And how do we find a way to, and I think it's just a huge, scary issue that people, so I'm wondering if that isn't why you're not asked about it more often, that it's just too big.
Yeah, but maybe. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, maybe a scale issue on some level. You know, I mean, not to say that trauma isn't I mean, trauma actually is the equivalent in medicine to physical shock. And the endpoint of trauma, if it's fully played out, is death. People do die of trauma, and happen during the Holocaust. So, but yes, it may be a scale issue, in part, because there's nothing like, trauma, at least theoretically, maybe there's a therapy or there's something. And likewise, guilt, at least theoretically, there's some potential atonement imaginable. But loss is irretrievable, leaves us helpless. Maybe that's part of the question.
Now, I quickly saw or briefly saw Eva Fogelman raising her hands as well. Eva, would you still like to comment? I also see your question in the Q&A. Or would
People will be upset with me about intergenerational trauma, I think.
Hank, shall we go back to the questions?
Sure.
There's a lot of questions I'd like you to
Please.
respond to. So Eva's questions then, thanks for all you have been doing for Holocaust survivors over many years. You have made a difference in many lives. In your listening to Holocaust survivors, have any shared being sexually abused?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. I mean, of course, as we all know, as Eva certainly knows, it's more common that that's become part of the discussion for a variety of reasons that have to do, of course, with cultural changes. But that's included men as well as women who are sexually abused and exploited. And also romantic relationships, which were consensual, which, in my experience, more survivors have talked about as years have gone on. Some during the war, some after, during the period of liberation, in the first months. So that's also become part of, what I've heard. So for sure, yes. And we know, we know rape and genocide are part of each other horrifically.
I think now I see a response to the last question, one by Karen Tsang. I'd like to read. Yes, my response was, it is unfathomable, and I think that's what I hear from Nancy, but also one has to keep going with loss in my own experience. And Eva wanted to speak. Can we unmute Eva, please? I didn't hear you. You were still muted. Eva, go ahead now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Okay. Loss is, there's no one answer to the question of how survivors dealt with loss. At liberation, survivors began to look for relatives all over. There are still survivors that are in denial about having lost certain relatives, and if they go to a place, they're always looking at we used to be the phone book. Now everybody's looking stuff up online. And so you do still have some people that are in a state of denial. And the early years, survivors had no time to really deal with the loss. They had to worry about, where they were going to live, what they were going to eat, and all that. And then it wasn't until, like, let's say the mid-50s, when they had, bar mitzvahs for their boys, some bat mitzvahs, they realized there is no family. And some of those individuals began to go into deep depressions. There were, some suicidal thoughts at that time. And I won't go into all the other details, except just to say that today, as Holocaust survivors are aging, the feelings of loss are coming back, and the mourning, and doing the mourning work that they did not do all those years. So with their own imminent death, they are re-experiencing the need to mourn people that they did not know. And I think all the, being involved with you, talking in the schools, is all part of the mourning process, in that one takes that experience, takes the loss and does something with the feelings in a, in a creative way, in a meaningful way, or in a political way. And that's all part of the mourning process.
Agree with all. Yep, absolutely. Agree with all of that. Thanks, Seva.
So there's a follow-up comment from Stacy. I agree with Nancy regarding the issue of scale. We don't have a cultural mechanism for dealing with loss on a personal level. Culturally, we often deal with it by not dealing with it. When there's not a personal grief or loss practice, we simply don't have the skills to engage with loss on a larger scale.
Right. As we all know, most of us do. I mean, Judaism is really quite wise in its way of dealing with, we'll say, quote, normal loss, going through Shiva, going through the periods, going through the year. But when it comes to loss on this scale, we're in a different place. And I think, as Eva was suggesting, we have these binaries, we all know, and it's a cliche to say. It's not like that. It's not getting over it. It's not getting over it. It's an evolution in people's lives in the ways that they remember and don't. But just the last thing that Eva said, I've been with a few survivors at the end, and it's just exactly, I mean, they think, the folks I know anyway, less about the future, the legacy and what will happen, and more about mom, more about that, and more about the world that was, and with a ferocious loyalty in many cases. And so it happens, as you suggest, different ways all the way through.
Also want to read Eva's follow-up comment on intergenerational trauma. Eva writes, I agree with Henry about the overuse of intergenerational trauma. Researchers are attributing genetics and epigenetics when the field is in its embryonic stage and no definite results are found. Now I'm going back to the top of the list. I'm just following it. And it's by Bellery. Hi, Bellery. And Bellery asks, can you speak about the schmooze with respect to teaching the Holocaust through remnants? How do you feel about students taking on the performance of the monologues as part of their learning? How might you structure such an aesthetic engagement and remembering through an art form?
Yeah. So I'm going to be, Valerie knows a lot more about this than I do. So hello, first of all, but you know me, and I'm very possessive about this piece and very selective in terms of who does it. Not with other work of mine that's dramatic, but with this piece, because I know the folks. So, I would say that I've worked with some students and older folks than students, but I'm still enough of a control freak about this piece that I want to be involved in terms of, as a semi-director or consultant. I am not ready. Maybe I will be, to just sort of release the script and whatever. In terms of the impact, I think, again, if some students have done extraordinary work, and again, the impact is quite variable, I would say, with this. But a lot will depend on whether they have taken the time, not 15 years like I did, but taken the time to, as one does when one prepares a role adequately, to really think through why is it this way? What is being communicated here? What is the goal of this speaker? How are they connecting and intending to connect with their listeners? Because it's different for each segment. If they go through all of that process, which can take time, and to get the background, then I'm for it. In terms of its impact on human rights education, again, I have to say I'm a bit of an agnostic. I don't know, because that hasn't been it has been my goal per se. Yeah. So, and you would know better than I do about that. So, I mean, if you want to add yourself or what you would hope would happen, that'd be cool. So, as you want.
Valerie, would you like to add anything? Otherwise, I'm looking at the time.
Okay,
We
so
have more questions than we can respond. So I'm picking two, and the other ones will keep the record, and we have you, Hank, respond to the person asking the question, but probably won't be able to do it during the live session. I want to go to Seema Gugutfri's comments. Seema writes, many thanks for this extraordinary presentation, and moreover, for your practice. I do wish my parents, both Holocaust survivors with very different stories each, had the opportunity to tell those stories to him as a neutral but empathic listener. In my experience, my mother was more inclined to tell my children her stories than me until the final years of her life.
Yeah, it's a comment, I'm glad that you had that chance, that she had that chance. One hears, I think it's quite, I'm thinking of the families whom I've known, and it's not too unusual for one of the parents to be the talker and the other not. It's true with Agi, her husband, who's also a survivor, was actually against. I mean, she quotes him as saying, if this is the topic, I'm leaving the room. Right? He was a partisan, basically. No. But as she put it, then he came out of his shell and he started to talk more. So to retell more. So it's going to be, yes, various, of course.
And Valerie writes, it is precisely because of your careful shaping of the monologues themselves and in describing the process of their construction and delivery that I ask. And Joanne Gilbert writes, profound respect and gratitude to Hank for his heartfelt work in humanizing the unimaginable, for giving words to the unspeakable. And we have only, please forgive me, participants, there's a lot of very important, very difficult question that is impossible to ask Hank to answer them in 1 or 2 minutes. But I want to end with Ria Tregebov's question. Ria writes, it was so moving to hear describe the impact of the schmoozing as ecstatic. But did you also find there was a personal cost to you hearing these painful stories?
Sometimes. I would say less than I would have guessed going in early on. And there'd be times when I would, even in performance, I'm surprised sometimes when it becomes sort of real to me. And of course, a good performance, you're right on the edge of that if it's good. So I wouldn't call it a cost, really, but I guess what softens it is the fact that I know these folks. I love these folks. And so it's a part of the relationship. It's part of learning together that I even have the privilege of doing that. So, they're on my shoulder, they're behind me, in front of me, etc. And so I think, I would say the cost relative to all that I have gained personally in every way, relationships, closeness, knowledge, heart, it far outweighs whatever cost there's been. So, yeah.
So I want to end with giving thanks to you. Alan Berkowitz writes, thank you, Professor, for another enlightening and emotionally impactful presentation. Yasha Koa, Jennifer Myers writes, Charles and I were very moved by this compelling retrospective of your work. Ria, thank you, writes, thank you both so much for this exceptional presentation. Robert Ehrenreich writes, thank you so much, Hank. Your presentation, as always, also informative and inspiring. And my apologies to those questions that we cannot ask that are important and deserve an answer. But I'm now 1 minute over. We are 1 minute over time already.
This is a 10-second. Please do not hesitate to be in touch with me directly if you want to be. My email is easy to find. And, if I say it, you won't remember anyway, but it's basically H. Greens without the AN, because University of Michigan can only tolerate 8 letters at the beginning before you get to the little at thing. So it's that at umich.edu, University of Michigan, and it will schmooze. So good.
Hank, it has been a great privilege, pleasure, delight, and honor learning together with you today. From the bottom of my heart, from our hearts, thank you. And thank you to all our webinar participants for being with us today. So if you'd like to receive news about our upcoming webinar sessions, please send an email to Public Humanities, ubc.ca. It's in the link. And thank you, everyone, again. Stay well and have a great day. And thank you, Hank. Yes, final words from Hank?
Just peace. God knows, peace, 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 peace in our hearts and obviously in the world. What more do we need?